Hello and welcome to 10 Lenses. I'm Adam Thomas. This is our third session out of 10. We've already talked about translations, we've talked about the page of the Bible, and today we're going to talk about choosing a passage to study. You might think that that sounds really easy to do. And you'd be right, it actually is pretty easy to do, but we're going to talk about it anyway because there are a few things to get out there. So the Bible is pretty big. This is actually a library, not a book. It's filled with different books, 50 plus in the Old Testament, almost 30 in the New Testament. Those books are broken down into chapters, like we talked about last week, and those chapters are broken down into verses. Now, studying a whole chapter at once is a little bit too much. Studying a verse is a bit too little, so we need to find an in-between place to go. Many Bibles, as we talked about last week, have section headers. And those section headers, they're okay to pick a passage, but I want to stay away from those so that we can train ourselves to look for those passages on our own. I'd say that the upper limit of a passage that we'll take at one go is about 20 verses, and the lower limit about 5 verses. If you do more than 20, then you're biting off a little bit more than you can chew and digest at once, and therefore you run the risk of glossing over things, of missing parts of the text that you might see if you were studying a smaller portion. If you read too little, then you run the risk of not seeing that little bit of text in its greater context. So it's good to try to get somewhere between 5 and 20. I'd say 10 to 15 verses is your best bet. Some passages are longer than 20 verses. One great example is the parable of the prodigal son. It takes quite a bit longer than 20 verses to tell that story. So when you're studying the parable of the prodigal son or any other longer than 20 verse passage, it's a good idea to break it down into smaller, manageable chunks and then stitch it all together when you're done. Picking a passage of the Bible to study is sort of like eating a meal. If you eat too little, then you're still going to be hungry. If you eat too much, then you're going to have some indigestion. If we study too much of the Bible at once, we're going to miss things. If we study too little, then we're not going to be able to see how that little bit fits into a wider context. It's a good idea to put some boundaries on the passage you're studying at any one time, because putting limits on things helps us sort of focus our energy into a small area. Think about it like a sporting event that has a clock. The last couple of minutes of a football game are really exciting if the score is closed. Those are the limits that we see in the game. But a game of cricket might last 3 or 4 days. I don't know what's exciting about cricket. Maybe somebody can tell me. Okay, so how do you pick your 5 to 20 verses? The first thing to do is to look for transitional words. In the narrative parts of the Bible, this is pretty easy to do. Phrases like, after these things, the next day, 8 days later, at the time of the festival, any of those kind of things usually set off the next passage. The gospel is full of these little transitional moments. When you go to some of the other parts of the Bible, the poetry, the letters of Paul, finding the different sections, the different passages to study can be a little trickier. You can look for rhetorical devices, which sometimes show up really well in the original language, don't show up too well in English. It's a little bit trickier than finding the passages in the narrative, so we're going to try that first. So picking your passage in the narrative, pretty easy to do because of those transitional words. Picking it in other parts of the Bible can be a little trickier because they tend to be a little more flowy. Flowy, is that a word? So we're going to try an experiment together. We're going to see if we can figure out what this Sunday's gospel reading is without knowing the citation ahead of time, besides the book of the Bible and what the story is about. All right, so I'm going to say that the book of the Bible is Mark's gospel, and the story is about John the Baptist and Herod. I'm going to give you a little clue. It's in chapter 6. So what I want you to do in a few seconds is to pause this video, click the link underneath the video on the page, go to the passage, and figure out what you think this Sunday's gospel lesson is, and then come back and keep watching the video. I'm going to offer you a couple of nice scenic vistas for you to pause the screen on. Okay, so ready? There's 3 of them. You can pause on any one you want. All right, go ahead. All right, I hope you paused the video and did the little exercise. If you did, you probably discovered that the passage stood out pretty clearly from the rest of the chapter. It really does jump off the page because it's about something completely different than the rest of the chapter is about. So, show of hands, who got Mark 6:14-29 as their passage? If that's what you got, that's also what the people who wrote our lectionary got. That's the story of Herod beheading John the Baptist because Herod made a promise and kept it, neither of which he should have ever done. All right, so that's our passage for this Sunday. We're going to do a few more examples later in the session after the video. The last thing I want to talk about in the video is the special word that people who study the Bible full-time use to talk about passages, just in case you ever encounter it later on. That word is pericope, P-E-R-I-C-O-P-E. It looks like pericope, but it's pronounced pericope. If you type that word into Microsoft Word, Bill Gates will try to change it into the word periscope, so be careful. Pericope is Greek for to cut around, and that's what we do when we pick a passage to study. We sort of cut it out of the text, and we study it, and then we put it right back in for safekeeping. Like I said at the beginning of the video, picking a passage isn't all that difficult, but it's really important to help us focus our energy as we study in a particular session. So this is session 3 about passages, picking your pericopes, picking your pericopes, and we'll see you next week for another session of 10 Lenses. I hope you'll write a comment, do some of the examples, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.